What happens to a person when they find out they belong to an ethnic group they didn't know about? That their parents knowingly hid this fact from them so they could fit in, so they could have a better life? What happens when they hear about how sad and pitiful it is to be part of this dying culture, and they find out they are one? Would they reconnect to their roots, learn about this hidden culture, or accept assimilation to avoid any chance at discrimination? How can a person make such a choice? Increasingly, more people in Japan are finding out they're not Japanese, or really, not completely, but rather part Ainu, one of the indigenous people of Japan. Oki Kano was 20 years old when he found out. He chose to discover his culture and accept this as part of who he is. He became a musician, incorporating traditional Ainu instruments and musical styles of his own. You're listening to one of his songs now. But think about the countless others who chose differently, the ones who decided to hide this identity. It's not hard to see how the Ainu are dying, when it's easier to just not be one. So first, some definitions. Who are the Ainu people? According to Wikipedia, the Ainu people are a group indigenous to Hokkaido, parts of Honshu, the Kuril Islands, and Sakhalin, but the majority live in Hokkaido. They're believed to be descended from the Jomon people who inhabited the Japanese islands between 14,000 to 300 BCE. Currently, official estimates place the total Ainu population within Japan at around 25,000 people. However, unofficial estimates place that number at around 200,000 or higher due to the near total assimilation of Ainu people into Japanese society, with many modern Ainu people having no idea of their ancestry. Next definition is more central to this essay, representation. What does that mean? Well, representation is the way media presents aspects of society, such as gender, age, and especially key to this essay, ethnicity, to audiences. These representations are ultimately formed by the media creator's ideology, how they perceive the world, and it's whether or not they want to get those things across or not. It's important because the way things are presented to audiences have consequences on how the audience perceives those aspects of society, because then the audience must reconcile those perceived ideology against their own. Often, ideology is hidden, like in a drama movie, as opposed to being in the forefront like in a documentary. Part 1, History of Representation. Marcus P. Centeno Martin wrote a great article for Alphaville, a journal for film and media studies that goes really into depth about the history of Ainu representation in media and how it evolved through time. In this section, I will be summarizing parts of it, but I highly encourage you to read it. The link will be in the description. It's a fantastic article, but I digress. Ainu people have been being represented in film for as long as movies were being made. At the beginning of their representation in film, Ainu people and their iconography were used as a sort of opposite to Japanese culture. Ainu people were seen as primitive and exotic, while Japanese people were civilized and normal. Early ethnographic film, between the 1910s and 30s, portrayed them pretty romantically, ignoring the social issues surrounding them, creating an ahistorical portrait. A narrative developed that Ainu people were a vanishing people because they could not adapt to the modern world, even though, according to census taking at the time, Ainu population was more or less stable. In other words, Ainu people were other. They were otherized. As Japan became increasingly militarized in the 30s, the narrative shifted in favor of fostering assimilation between the Ainu and the Japanese people to assist in the war effort. Following the American occupation of Japan, the Japanese film industry began creating something called the Muko Kuseki Eiga, or their films without nationality. And those films recycle genre conventions of Western cinema. In their versions of Western, the genre, films, a new image of Ainu people was created, the Giji Ainu, or pseudo-Ainu. Essentially, the Ainu people of these films were Ainu in name only. In every other aspect, they mirrored Native Americans in Western movies. As can be seen in this clip from the TV show The Samurai, or Onmitsu Kenshi. This wasn't the first comparison between the two groups, and it's not necessarily an unfounded one, but that's beside the point. At this point of history, there are two conflicting images of the Ainu people: the cultural image, where they were represented as other, and the political image, where they were part of the homogenized whole of Japan, or otherwise didn't exist. An example of this is in 1975, the Prime Minister of Japan declared to the Diet that Japan was a homogenized nation without the racial problems of the rest of the world. And in 1980, Japanese officials in the UN Committee for Human Rights asserted that the right for any human individual to enjoy their culture, profess their religion, or use their language is guaranteed in Japanese law. However, the minorities mentioned in the treaty were non-existent in Japan. Centeno Martin asserts that once the Ainu people were able to control the way they were represented in media, largely thanks to the Japanese filmmaker Tadayoshi Hameda and Shigeru Kayano, a prominent figure in the Ainu movement, they made a series of 5 documentaries about the Ainu people and their traditions. I'll go into more of this later. Part 2, Golden Kamuy. Fast forwarding to 2014, representation of Ainu people in media is still low to non-existent. But then a new manga comes out called Golden Kamuy. Set in the early 20th century, Saichi Sugimoto, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, learns about a hidden trove of Ainu gold, the location of which is hidden in the tattoos of a group of prisoners who escaped from the Abashiri prison. He joins the hunt for the treasure with Asirpa, a young Ainu girl, and together they struggle against the wilderness and the dangerous groups all vying to find the hidden gold. Written by Satoru Noda, Golden Kamuy is a modern hallmark and representation of Ainu culture. While Noda isn't Ainu, he was born in Hokkaido and researched Ainu culture and traditions extensively for the story. Moreover, Hiroshi Nakagawa, a professor of the Ainu language from Chiba University, also works as an advisor for the manga and the anime, said this in an interview with Asahi Shimbun. I was surprised at how he drew the characters to the finest details. If I were to create a textbook on the Ainu, I would love to publish this artwork. Outside the research done for the story, what really sets it apart is how the Ainu people are represented. Rather than depicting them as other, or a dying culture, or even non-existent, Noda uses Asirpa, the Ainu girl character, to depict a more normal Ainu life. These moments aren't exoticized, but rather accepted by the Japanese main character. When asked why he chose to write about the Ainu in an interview, Noda responded, "Actually, until now there are so few of them being representations of Ainu in media, does it not feel fresh for the readers? I think that since it is a delicate subject, people recoil from it. It brings along dark images of prosecution, discrimination, and such. But I was convinced if I make an Ainu-themed manga that is cheerful and interesting, it can become popular. Even the Ainu people whom I met to gather data told me, please do not portray miserable Ainu people anymore. Please draw strong Ainu people." Due to the well-researched and novel nature of the story, utilizing an underrepresented period of history with underrepresented characters allowed for it to skyrocket into popularity, swiftly garnering a strong fan base and an anime adaptation, even crossing into the international market. As of 2020, the manga and anime are still in production. Part 3. How representation affects reality. Briefly returning to the Centeno Martin article, he makes it clear that media representation has concrete effects on the groups represented. Through those documentaries produced between Hameda and Kayano, Ainu practices and traditions that were nearly lost due to assimilation to Japanese culture were revitalized. Through Kayano's freedom to represent himself and his people the way they wanted to be represented, he was able to reveal the state of Ainu identity as it was when the films were being made. Their problem wasn't one of Ainu people as a separate ethnic group, but of a group who had lost its ethnic identity. Luckily, through these documentaries, Kayano and Hameda were able to rescue ceremonies from the past that nearly disappeared from collective memory, such as the traditional Ainu wedding ceremony. The Ainu people were never formally recognized as the indigenous people of Hokkaido by the Japanese government until April 2019. I think it is quite the coincidence that this happened almost exactly 1 year after Golden Kamuy began its anime run in April of 2018. While I admit I don't necessarily think that the two events are directly connected, I believe it is possible that by having a big-name anime featuring positive representation of Ainu culture helped them re-enter the cultural conscious. I don't think that's too far of a stretch either, considering that the Hokkaido Tourism Organization began a campaign running from June 2018 to March 2019, the month before the official recognition, coincidence, that used Golden Kamuy to promote tourism engagement with local cultures of Hokkaido. This was done through an app where, upon visiting certain locations all across Hokkaido, you could collect characters from the anime, and once you got all of them, you got a special prize. Side note, I found out that they ran a second version of this campaign after the success of the first one, still featuring Golden Kamuy characters. Part 4. Conclusion. All in all, representation matters. The media we consume does so much to inform the way we perceive the world, as well as the social causes we deem important. It is not a matter that can be taken lightly either, of course. Representation requires understanding, and that requires research. And I can't just say, let's represent everyone in TV shows and movies, and the world will become a better place, because that doesn't seem likely. However, we can still recognize that representation directly affects communities, especially smaller ones, who may not have the opportunity to fully represent themselves. Thank you.